It all started one afternoon after school with three boys heading home while discussing about love confessions. Suddenly, one of the boys named Hirano looked into his bag and shouted that he had left something behind in the classroom. He told his friends to go on without him while he rushed back into the school building to retrieve what he had forgotten. But as he approached his classroom, he suddenly stopped when he heard a strange sound coming from inside. Hirano carefully peeked through the doorway and was shocked to find the prettiest chick in the entire school standing there. This beauty named Goindo was the true definition of charm and grace, and was famous for rejecting the confessions of all the simps in the school. When Goindo suddenly turned toward the door, Hirano quickly ducked out of sight. After a moment, he slowly lifted his head and began observing her every move inside the classroom. Hirano was confused when he saw her walking straight toward his desk. Still watching from behind the door, he was completely thrown off when Goindo sat down in his chair and began gently hugging his desk like some obsessed weirdo. This made Hirano wonder in amazement if the prettiest girl in school might somehow have feelings for him. Hirano was still struggling to figure out what was happening when he suddenly noticed her pulling a black, round object that looked like a ball out of her bag. Hirano's mind immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion, thinking it must be a bomb. He thought perhaps she didn't like him at all and wanted to take him out. But at that moment, as Hirano looked more closely into the classroom, he noticed Goindo removing a ribbon from a small stuffed toy and tying it around the black wrapped ball. Then, to his surprise, she kissed the ball with deep affection, making Hirano suddenly realize that the black ball wasn't a bomb after all, but a present for him. His doubts were confirmed when he saw her attempting to squeeze the neatly wrapped ball into the cramped space of his desk. What truly messed with his head was watching her desperately try to make it fit, despite it clearly being too big. It now seemed like his very first gift was about to be ruined, thanks to how violently Goindo was trying to cram it into his desk. For a brief moment, Hirano felt a wave of relief when he saw Goindo pause, apparently realizing the ball just wouldn't fit. But that relief quickly vanished when she angrily tossed all the books out of his desk and began aggressively smashing the ball against the inside, trying to force it in. When it still didn't enter, Goindo suddenly pulled out what looked like a weapon, leaving Hirano even more dumbfounded. His confusion only grew when he realized the so-called weapon was actually his recorder, and he wondered what on earth she planned on doing with it. For a brief moment, Goindo handled the recorder with unsettling care, like she was about to play it. But suddenly, she shoved it into the desk and slammed it down with full force, breaking the poor instrument clean in half. Hirano wasn't just stunned by the destruction of his recorder. This time, he was genuinely alarmed that she tried to use it as a lever to force the desk open. As Hirano kept watching in stunned silence, he noticed Goindo moving on to the legs of his desk and couldn't wrap his head around why she was going to such extremes for a riseless monkey like him. His eyes went wide with disbelief when the girl suddenly pulled a power drill out of her bag, ready to go full demolition mode on his desk. Hirano, confused, wondered why she didn't just keep the gift inside his locker or shoe rack. But then a sudden thought struck him. Hirano quickly rushed to check both, only to find them completely wrecked beyond recognition. Hirano returned to the classroom in shock, and when he peeked inside, he saw Goindo using the power drill to take out the legs of his desk. At last, Goindo was finished. She had completely dismantled the desk and placed its wooden frame on top of the oversized ball. At that moment, a teacher spotted Hirano lurking in the hallway and shouted at him, demanding to know why he was still at school and hadn't yet gone home. The teacher's voice startled Hirano, but when he glanced back into the classroom, he saw Goindo making her getaway by leaping out the window like a professional burglar. Just then, the teacher reached Hirano and gave him a whack on the head with a rolled-up paper. After a quick scolding from the teacher, Hirano stepped into the classroom and picked up the gift. He took one look at Goindo slipping away through the school garden, clearly surprised, but then turned his focus back to the gift. Hirano then finally unwrapped it and was stunned to find a soccer ball inside. The following day in class, Hirano sat at his new desk by the window when his friend asked him to check out something happening outside. Curious, Hirano turned to look but was momentarily blinded by the intense sunlight. Since he couldn't see, he asked what was going on. His friend explained that it was Goindo outside, busy with some kind of sports activity. His friend kept going on about how lucky he was to catch a glimpse of the gorgeous Goindo every day. Hirano wasn't shocked by the praise. After all, everyone at school admired Goindo for her stunning looks. But just hearing her name brought flashbacks to the day before. Hirano still couldn't wrap his head around the fact that someone as beautiful as Goindo could do something so disturbingly unhinged. Hirano's train of thought was cut short when his friend excitedly suggested they check out Goindo's club after class, as this would be the perfect chance to get closer to her. But that plan was immediately shut down. The same nosy, beer-bellied teacher from before overheard them and reminded them that today was the day for committee selections, meaning they weren't allowed to leave. The moment the bell rang, the teacher stepped out, leaving the class in the hands of the class representative to run the committee meeting. Following the teacher's instructions, the class rep walked up to the podium and asked if anyone wanted to volunteer for the disciplinary committee. The room fell into an awkward silence. No one raised their hand. All the students kept staring at their desks and weren't interested in joining the committee. Hirano had no interest in joining any committee. His only plan was to head straight home. As the silence dragged on and no one volunteered for the disciplinary committee, Hirano briefly considered raising his hand. But in the end, he decided against it. He figured being on the committee would just eat up all his free time after school. Plus, he'd probably end up being a burden to the others. If a girl ended up on the same committee, he imagined her constantly chasing him down to remind him of his responsibilities, and that just sounded like a hassle. Hirano figured that if he ever considered joining a committee, it would have to be the pet committee since he had a really soft spot for animals. He was also interested in the recycling committee, mainly because he thought sorting stuff sounded like a pretty easy gig. The one thing Hirano knew for sure was that he'd never join the athletic committee. That would mean constantly doing physical tasks during gym class, and the sports festival would be a nightmare. He had no athletic skills whatsoever, which would only make it all the more miserable. Glancing over at one of his classmates with a bulky, muscular build, Hirano figured that anyone joining the athletic committee needed to be as strong as that guy, not someone like him. While he was lost in thought, the class president repeated the call for volunteers to join the disciplinary committee. To everyone's surprise, this time a girl named Zama quietly raised her hand. The class immediately started cheering her on, completely ignoring her protests that this wasn't her intention. Hirano, meanwhile, was puzzled. Just moments ago, no one was willing to participate, but things seemed kinda different now. To his surprise, another student named Sori also raised his hand and joined in. Next, the class leader moved on to the health committee, announcing that they needed 2 boys and 2 girls. Hirano instantly sensed something was off when, without hesitation, 4 students shot their hands up right away. The same thing happened when the cleanup committee was announced. Volunteers popped up like it was planned. Hirano sat there, completely baffled, unable to figure out what in the world was going on. Hirano's suspicions went to a whole new level when the class leader announced the opening for the library committee, and suddenly, his friend shot his hand up, not out of interest, but because something had smacked him. The object rolled across the floor and stopped near Hirano's desk. When Hirano picked it up, his eyes widened in disbelief to find out it was a ball of ice. Hirano was more baffled than ever because the sky was clear, the sun was shining, and there was no way it could be hailing. Curious and suspicious, Hirano glanced out the window and spotted Goinda hiding in the bushes, holding a slingshot. Right then, she loaded it again and aimed their classroom, this time forcing a girl to raise her hand for the library committee. Hirano sat there, utterly dumbfounded, trying to wrap his head around why Goinda was pelting his classmates with ice balls. As bizarre as it was, her crazy antics were oddly effective. Committee spots were getting filled in record time. For a moment, Hirano wondered if Goinda was doing it to help him get out of class faster, so he could head home early. But he quickly brushed off the idea, convincing himself that she must be doing it for everyone's benefit, not just his. Despite her questionable approach, Hirano couldn't help but admire Goinda's strange form of kindness. Soon after, the class president announced the call for volunteers to the pet committee, mentioning that they needed 1 boy and 1 girl. Excited, Hirano immediately shot his hand up, eager to join. But just as quickly as his hand went up, it came crashing back down. An ice ball had smacked him square on the hand, completely catching him off guard. At the same time, 2 other students, a boy and a girl, were also struck by ice balls, causing their hands to shoot up, finalizing the selection for the pet committee. Hirano was devastated. His beloved committee, the only one he actually cared about, had slipped through his fingers. He wanted to object, to speak up, but the words just wouldn't come out. Then the class president announced it was time to pick members for the athletic committee. Hirano kept his hand firmly down. There was no way he was volunteering for that. But before he could relax, another ice ball smacked his hand, jerking it upward against his will. At this point, Hirano was convinced that Goinda had to know he was the one who peeked at her the day before, and this was her twisted way of punishing him. In his mind, that was the only explanation for why she'd force him into the athletic committee. The one thing guaranteed to drain the life out of him. Not long after his hand was volunteered, another boy raised his hand willingly. Then, to make things worse, the bulky dude named Gorisuji followed suit. Now there were 3 boys vying for only 2 spots on the committee, and the situation had just gotten messier. This turn of events was a massive relief for Hirano, and without hesitation, he lowered his hand, ready to back out and escape the nightmare that was the athletic committee. The class president asked if he was officially withdrawing, but just as Hirano opened his mouth to answer, another ice ball smacked into him, jerking his hand back into the air. Stunned and frustrated, Hirano made several attempts to lower his hand again, but each time he tried, another icy projectile nailed him, leaving him no choice but to keep his hand raised like a prisoner. As Hirano glanced around the classroom, he noticed Gorisuji getting absolutely bombarded by hundreds of ice balls. But the Chika-chan didn't flinch. He stood there with his hand raised high, tanking each icy hit like it was nothing. Watching this bizarre showdown, Hirano came to a realization. Goinda was clearly trying her hardest to force Gorisuji out of the athletic committee. But what confused Hirano even more was why she wasn't going after the other guy at all. Hirano was beyond impressed. He found himself silently cheering Gorisuji on, admiring the guy's sheer willpower and endurance. Gorisuji was clearly the ideal fit for the athletic committee, taking every hit like a champ. But of course, Goinda wasn't one to back down. True to form, she doubled down on her assault, launching ice balls at the big guy with even more force. When she realized that her slingshot wasn't cutting it anymore, Goinda pulled out the big gun. With a weapon that looked straight out of a snowball war zone, she unleashed a blizzard of ice balls that practically buried Gorisuji under a hailstorm of frozen fury. Hirano was stunned by how ridiculously prepared Goinda was. She had clearly come to class with a whole arsenal. Wanting to give Gorisuji the spot he genuinely deserved, Hirano tried once more to lower his hand. But Goinda wasn't having it. She blasted him with an even heavier shower of ice balls, forcing his hand to stay frozen in the air. With that, the decision was sealed. The class president finally announced that Hirano and the other god, Tomoda, would be the new athletic committee members. After class, Hirano found himself standing in the hallway next to Tomoda, who was already grumbling about how miserable it was to be stuck in the athletic committee. Hirano nodded in agreement, though his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Goinda. He was convinced she must truly hate him for what happened that day when he accidentally saw her. Even though he hadn't told a soul, it felt like she was punishing him. Not long after, Hirano and Tomoda attended their first athletic committee meeting, only to get scolded right off the bat for showing up late. But Hirano wasn't paying much attention to the lecture. His mind was completely hijacked by the sight of Goinda, who was sitting right next to him. Just being that close to her sent his heart racing like crazy, pounding 1,000 beats per minute. Usually, when school ends, students are relieved to escape the dull classroom routine and dive into exciting games outdoors. But for Hirano, today was anything but normal. He found himself trapped in the athletic committee meeting, where nearly everyone looked half asleep with boredom. The whole scene only made him regret joining the committee even more. But on the other hand, Goinda appeared genuinely engaged in the dull lecture, which left Hirano questioning whether she actually enjoyed these boring meetings. The thought of how annoying the whole situation was brought Hirano back to the painful reality that he hadn't joined the committee by choice, but was practically forced into it. He couldn't shake the suspicion that Goinda had somehow roped him into this just so they could see each other every day. With those thoughts in his head, Hirano began daydreaming about a moment after class where he clumsily tripped and landed on top of Goinda. In his fantasy, Goinda teasingly asked if he wanted to get closer to her, but he turned her down. Annoying that she caught him off guard like that, Hirano was so deep into his thoughts that the line between imagination and reality started to blur. Hirano even found himself wondering if getting closer was her way of hinting at kissing, or maybe something even more. As his mind wandered with all those strange thoughts, Hirano distracted himself by trying to spin a pencil in his hand, unsuccessfully every single time. Growing increasingly frustrated, he practically begged the pen to spin just once, already picturing how cool it would look if he nailed it. But suddenly, Hirano caught sight of a pencil spinning flawlessly. Turning his head, he saw Goinda effortlessly twirling her pencil between her fingers like a total pro. Goinda twirled the pen using all kinds of advanced techniques, making it obvious she was the queen of pen spinning. She was so locked into her own little world, fully focused on her moves, that Hirano noticed her arm trembling from the sheer intensity. It wasn't long before he realized her entire body was starting to shake from the effort she was putting in. Out of nowhere, Goinda leveled up and began spinning the pen with her hands, raised in the air like she'd entered some next-level mode. Before Hirano could even process what was going on, she launched the pen straight at the teacher. To his shock, the pen made a perfect loop around the clueless teacher and flew right back into Gonda's hand, where she caught it flawlessly, still spinning like nothing happened. And just when it seemed like she was done, she pulled out 2 more pens and began twirling all 3 with insane precision, like a girl possessed, not dropping a single one. Hirano was completely blown away by the spectacle unfolding in front of him. Even though he knew she was going way over the top, he couldn't help but watch with his mouth hanging open, like he'd been dropped into a live-action Looney Tunes circus. Honestly, at that point, he felt like Gonda could launch her own talent show and take the world by storm. Just then, the teacher announced the end of the meeting, but Hirano was way too mesmerized by Gonda's performance to even pay any attention. His attention stayed locked on her as he noticed something odd in her hand. It took him a moment, but he eventually realized it was his specially crafted pen, made for spinning other pens. The sheer creativity left him stunned. For a brief second, their eyes met, but Gonda quickly looked away before he could figure out what that moment actually meant. At last, the class was dismissed, and the teacher walked out, completely unaware of the wild talent show that had just unfolded right under his nose. At the same time, Gonda finally brought her performance to a halt. Hirano thought back to the moment their eyes seemed to meet, but quickly brushed it off, assuming it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. Out of nowhere, Hirano's mind nearly went blank when he saw Gonda stand up and head directly toward his desk. His imagination kicked into overdrive, instantly assuming she was about to confess her feelings. But that hope was crushed in an instant when she simply placed a pencil in his hand and introduced herself in a calm, formal tone. After introducing herself, she calmly walked out of the classroom, leaving Hirano and the other committee members stunned as they watched her go. Hirano was completely thrown off. He couldn't tell if Gonda had introduced herself because they were both on the athletic committee, or if she just wanted to erase the embarrassment of his awful pen-spinning failure. In the end, Hirano convinced himself it was all just a misunderstanding, and there was no chance someone as pretty as Gonda would ever confess to him. But just outside the classroom, Gonda sank down against the wall, crushed by the thought that she didn't get to spend more time with Hirano. As school finally ended for the day, Hirano walked out of the building, only to be greeted by an unexpected downpour. To make matters worse, he hadn't brought an umbrella. Annoyed with himself, he couldn't help but think how much easier things would have been if he just asked one of his buddies to lend him theirs before they left. While he stood there wondering what to do, he suddenly heard a group of girls talking nearby. Turning toward the sound, he realized it was Gonda and her friends also leaving the school. The girls were complaining about how annoying the sudden rain was. Seeing that they were distracted, Hirano, feeling awkward and shy, tried to quietly hide so they wouldn't notice him. Unfortunately, his plan failed. The girls spotted him almost right away, and recognizing that he was a first-year student, walked over to him. Noticing how nervous he looked, the mean girls didn't waste a second and started teasing him. Hirano got really anxious and was really concerned about his mental health, but he didn't get a chance to escape, as one of the girls pulled his arm and started comparing their heights. After the comparison, the mean girl mocked him for being the same height as Kevin Hart, and then they went back to making fun of him for nervously shaking like a wet puppy. Even with all the teasing going on, Hirano's brain was more focused on the girls' soft melons pressed against his arm than all the gutter they were spitting. But he quickly came back to his senses when one of the girls suddenly claimed she had a brilliant idea. To his shock, the girls stopped messing with him and instead told Gonda to lend him her spare umbrella. Just like that, the duo left, saying they had a cooking class to attend. Hirano stood there, heart pounding, waving them off, only to get smacked in the face by the sharp edge of an umbrella out of nowhere. The sudden jab to the cheek snapped Hirano back to reality. Hirano winced and rubbed his aching cheek, muttering a thanks to Gonda for the umbrella. Of course, his imagination kicked in right away as he wondered if the smack was because Gonda was jealous of him talking to the other girls. But just as fast, he shut the thought down, reminding himself there was no chance she'd be jealous. She was probably just being nice by offering him an umbrella, nothing more. He apologized for the inconvenience and promised he'd clean the umbrella and return it later. But the moment he opened it, he was taken aback. The top was completely torn. At first, Hirano brushed it off as some new trend and jokingly called it the open concept style. Still, he figured that if this was fashion, it definitely required some expert-level skills to pull off. The whole situation only made him more certain. Gonda wasn't like normal humans, she was something else entirely. Hirano let out a quiet sigh of relief when Gonda gave him a playful wink and pulled out another umbrella from her bag, like she was reaching into some kind of dimensional storage. But his excitement didn't last. The new umbrella was in even worse shape than the first. It was just like the difficulty level was increasing. She kept pulling out more, and somehow, each umbrella was more broken than the last. At this point, Hirano was convinced the only things Goinda carried in that bag were umbrellas, or holes, to be more accurate. Still, Hirano reminded himself that beggars can't be choosers. He was borrowing after all, so he really had no right to be picky. Finally, Goinda handed him what seemed like the last umbrella. But just as he reached for it, she didn't let go. She held on tightly, making Hirano second-guess whether she was actually giving it to him. Flustered, he quickly apologized for assuming. But instead of saying anything, Goinda gently ran her hand along his arm, leaving him even more nervous and unsure of what was going on. Things took a wild turn, and before Hirano knew what was happening, he found himself walking side by side with Goinda, both sharing the same umbrella. He could hardly believe this was really happening. Just to be sure, he gave himself a quick pinch to make sure he was not dreaming. For a moment, he was stunned by how close she was, but then his attention shifted to her beautiful, delicate eyelashes, capturing his attention like they were the only thing in the world. Not only that, Hirano got an up-close look at her flawless, glowing skin. It was so smooth and shiny, it almost looked like glass. Caught up in the moment, Hirano accidentally bumped into Goinda. He immediately freaked out and jumped from the surprise, but Goinda quickly grabbed his arm, pulling him in so close to kissing. Flustered, Hirano awkwardly curved to dodge a potential incident, all while silently repeating to himself how terribly wrong the situation was. Goinda looked completely unbothered, while Hirano was visibly panicking, unsure of where to set his eyes. No matter how hard he tried not to stare, his gaze accidentally landed on her undergarments, which sent his thoughts spiraling. It took him a moment to piece together why he had such a clear view was because her clothes were drenched. Hirano suddenly spotted a faint red line beneath her uniform and guessed it might be the outline of her melon cover. That was all it took for his imagination to run off again, this time picturing Goinda in a bikini. Hirano barely managed to keep it together, but his excitement quickly turned to disappointment when the striking red line suddenly vanished. Just as he was about to mourn the loss, it flickered back into view, then disappeared again. Confused and trying to figure out what was going on, Hirano looked up to see Goinda casually flash a small card with the word "lewd" written on it. That's when it hit him, the red sensor bar wasn't random. It was a powerful and private item all along. The following day in school, Hirano stayed behind to help out his teacher with organizing her office. She seemed genuinely pleased by his help, clearly needing the extra support. While Hirano brushed it off as nothing, claiming it wasn't a big deal, the truth was that he stayed a little bit longer in school to avoid Goinda at all costs. Once he finished tidying up the office, Hirano made his way down the hallway toward his classroom to grab his bag. On the way, though, he couldn't shake thoughts of Goinda or the awkward walk they shared the day before. He kept telling himself that she was simply being nice, nothing more. Still, despite that reassurance, Hirano had made up his mind to keep his distance from her for now. Just as he reached for the classroom door, he stopped in his tracks when he heard voices coming from inside. He immediately peeked into the classroom with caution and, to his surprise, saw none other than Goinda already inside. The sight caught him off guard. He had deliberately stayed late just to avoid her, yet here she was, standing there like some ethereal goddess who had wandered into his world. Hirano noticed she was wearing an apron, but for some inexplicable reason, it felt like he could see right through it. He quickly tried to shake off the thought, blaming the strange effect on the lighting and scolding his own dirty imagination. Maybe, he told himself, if he looked again with a virgin mind, it would be different. Just as he expected, when he glanced back inside, Goinda looked completely normal. Hirano was doing everything he could to keep his wild thoughts under control, which wasn't easy, especially now that Goinda's hot friends were there too. All three of them, dressed in aprons, looked like total knockouts. The sight made them seem more like tasty treats than classmates. It finally clicked for Hirano, making him realize that they must have just come from a cooking class. While still sneaking a glance through the classroom door, Hirano overheard the girls asking Goinda if she wanted to do it herself. At the same time, he noticed the girls staring awkwardly at his bag sitting on the desk. Suddenly, one of Goinda's friends gave her a little push toward the bag, followed by the others flashing her a good luck sign. And the girls casually exited the class, though Hirano quickly caught sight of them walking out and hid. The moment they were gone, Hirano resumed peeking inside and saw Goinda, handbag in hand, making her way toward his bag. Hirano watched in suspense as Goinda leaned over at his desk and began pulling something out of her bag. When she revealed what looked like a Morning Star weapon, his imagination ran wild, and he thought she might be an assassin sent to take him out. Based on her appearance alone, Hirano figured her attack stats would be off the charts, and the spiked weapon in her hand only added to the illusion that she was some kind of video game boss. But surprisingly, Hirano was shocked when, instead of swinging it, Goinda gently kissed the Morning Star. That unexpected gesture threw him off, and he suddenly wondered if it wasn't a weapon after all, and it might actually be a gift. Hirano convinced himself that the second option made way more sense after all. Schoolgirls don't exactly walk around with medieval weaponry like Morning Stars, and they definitely don't go around kissing them like it's no big deal. Then again, Goinda seemed like the kind of unpredictable queen who might just be into that kind of bizarre stuff. She didn't hesitate for even a second as she started opening his bag. For a brief moment, Hirano panicked, worrying she might stumble across something sketchy, like his hidden stash of rated 18 manga. But he quickly relaxed, realizing there was nothing embarrassing in there today. But then things took a quick turn when Hirano noticed that the strange Morning Star was now somehow crammed into his bag. It clearly didn't fit properly, but knowing Goinda by now, he wasn't even surprised to see her trying to jam it in there with sheer determination. For a brief moment, completely caught up in the chaos, Hirano actually found himself admiring her persistence and silently cheering for his poor bag to make it out alive. Since the girls had a cooking class earlier, Hirano guessed that the Morning Star might have been something they made, though he wasn't sure if it was even meant to be eaten. After thinking it over for a moment, Hirano concluded it was probably a cookie. That thought made him even more impressed by Goinda's cooking skills, and he found himself picturing her in the kitchen. However, it was still hard for Hirano to believe Goinda had gone through all that effort just for him. A moment later, Hirano returned to anxiously rooting for his bag, which was now in Goinda's determined grip, as she tried to force the ball inside. He still couldn't wrap his head around the fact that Goinda genuinely believed the ball would fit if she just tugged hard enough. With the bag already stretched to its limit, Hirano began to feel nervous. After all, he needed that bag for school the next day. When Goinda briefly stepped away from his bag, it felt like Hirano's silent prayers had been answered. He figured she had finally decided to give up, for once. But that hope vanished quickly when he realized she was just coming up with a new plan to make the object fit. Without warning, Goinda sprang into action. She pulled all of his books out of the bag and began wrapping them around the Morning Star. Once she was done, she grabbed a rubber band from her pocket and secured the books tightly in place. The whole scene had Hirano on edge as he watched Goinda wrestle with his bag. It dawned on him that all this effort could have been avoided. If she simply removed the spikes from the ball, it would slide in without a problem. While he was worried about the damage being done to his poor bag, he was also concerned about the cookie. After everything it had been through, he wasn't sure it would still be edible. All of a sudden, the rubber band snapped and struck Goinda right in the forehead. From his spot behind the door, Hansano immediately let out a sharp, loud gasp, imagining how painful it must have been. But he quickly crouched down, hoping she hadn't heard him. Meanwhile, inside the classroom, tears welled up in Goinda's eyes as a small bruise began to form where the band had hit. When Hirano peeked into the classroom again and saw her in tears, he quietly stepped inside, hoping to offer some comfort. He gently asked if she was all right, but the moment Goinda saw him, she panicked and took off running. Without warning, she leaped right out the classroom window, leaving Hirano frozen in place, completely bewildered by what had just happened. It was the first time he had ever seen a girl cry like that, and he had no clue how to handle it. It didn't take long for Hirano to realize that the best thing he could do now was to eat the cookies with gratitude. But as he bit into one of the spiky parts of the ball, it suddenly split cleanly into two halves. To his surprise, a packet of cookies dropped out from inside. Hirano couldn't help but feel embarrassed. He had actually believed the spikes were meant to be eaten. Later on, as Hirano made his way home with the spike ball still tucked in his bag, he stopped briefly to greet his friend standing near the shoe rack. Just then, his friend spotted a girl passing by and called out, asking if she was free to walk home together. The girl, Aiko, one of Goinda's friends, turned him down right away, saying she only walked home with guys she had a crush on. She was about to walk off after the rejection when her eyes suddenly landed on Hirano, who was trying to stay hidden behind his friend. She recognized him right away and asked what he thought of the cookies they had given him. Hirano responded with a polite bow and told her they were absolutely delicious. Aiko paused for a moment, then suddenly asked for his phone. Thinking she might be asking for payment for the cookies, Hirano nervously handed his phone over, his hands trembling from the sheer anxiety of speaking to a girl. But instead of asking for money, Aiko saved her number in his phone and handed it back. Before walking off, she warned him that if he ever ignored her call, she'd come after him. After Aiko left, Hirano stood frozen, staring at her name on his screen in disbelief. The next day during recess, Hirano sat alone in the classroom, his head resting in his hands as he struggled to figure out the mystery known as girls. For the first time ever, a girl had come up to him and asked for his number. And now, for the first time in his life, our boy actually had a girl's contact saved on his phone. Even though girls were still a complete mystery to him, that didn't stop Hirano from feeling excited about the whole thing. His friend used to tease him for not having any girls' numbers, so he would list his mom's name as a cover. That's why having a real girl's contact meant so much to him. He couldn't help but grin proudly at this small but meaningful achievement. Out of nowhere, a loud notification sound went off from a guy's phone in class, making everyone around him jump. It was almost like the guy with the low cut already knew who the message was from, because as soon as he checked it, he started sweating like crazy. He muttered that it was a message from a senior, and if he didn't respond quickly, there'd be consequences. Just hearing that made Hirano tense up, instantly thinking about how he might suffer Aiko's wrath if he ignored her or took too long to reply. Still, Hirano did his best to stay calm, convincing himself that someone like Aiko would never bother messaging a riseless nobody like him. But it was as if the universe had other plans. Right then, his phone chimed, forcing him to almost throw it away because of the sudden shock. Hirano opened his phone and covered his mouth in shock when he realized that it was a message from none other than Aiko. His fingers trembled as he slowly reached out to click on the message. When Hirano finally opened the message, he was nearly knocked off his seat by what he saw, a bold photo from Aiko, along with a question asking what he thought it was. His overactive imagination jumped to conclusions, immediately assuming it had to be a shot of her milk factory. He considered ignoring it, but then Aiko's earlier warning flashed through his mind. Not wanting to risk her anger, he decided to play it safe and replied that the picture was unclear. Unfortunately, as he typed, autocorrect betrayed him and changed his message to say cleavage instead. Before Hirano could even hit delete, it was too late. Aiko had already seen the message. Not long after, she sent another photo, this time of her and a friend pointing at her elbow. Right after that came a follow-up message explaining that it was her elbow all along, complete with a cheeky tongue-out emoji. Meanwhile, in their class, Aiko and her friend were cracking up, thrilled with how well their prank on Hirano had worked. They had him good, and he fell for their tricks. Still giggling over his reaction, Aiko showed the phone to Goinda, and then the girls said they finally understood why she was so into the cute little guy. But before they could say more, Goinda angrily snatched the phone from Aiko's hand and warned her sternly to quit bothering Hirano. Without another word, Goinda walked out, leaving the girls sitting there watching her leave, stunned by the impact of her cold stare. With Aiko's phone in hand, Goinda walked through the corridor and then took a peek inside Hirano's classroom. She spotted him being teased by his friend, but rather than stepping in, she quietly turned away and made her way to the restroom to splash some water on her face. Not long after, Hirano also walked into the restroom, completely unaware that Goinda was already there. Just as he bent down to take a drink, he was startled to see her standing right next to him. But Goinda wasn't in the mood for any conversation. She calmly finished drinking, turned off the tap, and walked away after calling him a dummy. Hirano remained frozen in place, staring at the still running water, utterly baffled by how confusing girls could be. Afterward, Hirano returned to class, still stuck on the fact that Goinda had called him a dummy. Once he got back, he ended up spilling the beans to his homies that someone had recently called him that. However, he deliberately left out Goinda's name from the story. When his friends pushed him to reveal who said it, Hirano pretended not to know and simply mentioned that it was a senior. Curious, his friends asked if it was the elbow senior, referring to Aiko. Just hearing her name made Hirano tense up, and he quickly denied that it was her. Still eager to uncover who it was, they asked if the person was a girl. This time, Hirano paused for a moment before finally admitting that yes, it was. Once they confirmed it was a girl, his friends began asking if he had done anything to upset her. Hirano firmly denied it, insisting he hadn't done a thing. Then Yujin, one of his friends, asked him to mimic how the girl had called him an idiot. Hirano nailed the impression exactly the way Goinda had said it, and his friends burst into cheers, saying it was actually a positive sign. Hirano stood there with a puzzled look on his face as Yujin explained that he was actually lucky, because that senior probably had a crush on him. Hirano looked even more stunned as Yujin went on about how confusing girls could be. According to him, when a girl calls a guy a dummy, what she really means is that she finds him cute. Similarly, if a girl says she doesn't like someone, it's usually because she secretly does. Their other friend was clearly impressed by Yujin's explanation and started hyping him up as the class's very own love guru. After wrapping up his love class, Yujin threw an arm around Hirano's shoulder and told him it was time to confess his feelings. Hirano wasn't entirely sold on the idea, but when Yujin asked if he actually wanted a girlfriend, and even held his hand for dramatic effect, Hirano quickly admitted that he definitely did. Seeing his chance to help, Yujin handed him a piece of paper, which he dubbed a love ticket. On it was a note asking the girl to meet behind the gym after school to talk about something important. After giving him the note, Yujin wished him luck once more, encouraging him to go for it. But deep down, Hirano still wasn't fully on board with the whole confessing plan. Later that evening at home, Hirano sat staring at his phone, lost in thought as Yujin's words replayed in his mind. Despite everything, he was still set on not confessing his feelings. But the whole messy situation was starting to get under his skin. His dad, Bonsaku, noticed how tense he looked and asked if something was bothering him. Hirano just muttered that everything was fine. Even without knowing the details, his dad, sounding like a full-on Nike spokesperson, told him to just do it, no matter what was weighing on him. His dad followed it up with some real talk, saying it's better to regret what you did than regret never trying at all. Bonsaku added that if something's bothering him, chances are the answer lies in facing it. Hirano brushed off the wisdom from his low-budget Gandhi of a dad and headed to his room, muttering that there was nothing good on TV. His father watched him walk away, a bit disheartened that all his practical advice seemed to fall flat. Despite the talk, Hirano couldn't get a wink of sleep that night, so much so that he ended up being the first one to arrive at school the next morning. The moment the beer-bellied teacher spotted him, he greeted Hirano warmly at the school gate, clearly impressed that he had shown up even before the students scheduled for morning training. Hirano, barely able to stay on his feet, wobbled as he admitted he hadn't slept well the night before. As Hirano took another step toward the entrance, he suddenly collapsed from dizziness but quickly scrambled to his feet. Seeing this, the teacher suggested he get some rest in his classroom. Strangely enough, Hirano responded with the same piece of advice his dad had given him the night before. As Hirano sluggishly made his way down the corridor, he noticed a teddy bear lying on the floor, one that belonged to Goinda. Apparently, she had dropped it the day before while hurrying home. Meanwhile, at the school entrance, Goinda arrived looking visibly downcast, clearly upset about having forgotten her bear. As she and her friends walked inside, they couldn't help but notice her gloomy expression and asked what was wrong. But all they got in return were quiet sighs. When they arrived at the shoe rack, her friend pointed out that Goinda's missing bunny had been placed inside the locker. They were all taken aback to see that someone had thoughtfully set it on a tissue. As the girls chatted about how sweet the gesture was and how much Goinda had been upset over losing her bunny, Goinda spotted a folded piece of paper tucked behind it. She read the note with surprise but decided not to share what it said with the others. Later that day, after school had ended, Hirano was seen anxiously pacing behind the gym, just where he had asked Goinda to meet him. Goinda appeared just as uneasy as she cautiously walked toward him, but Hirano was clearly in a full-blown panic. He was drenched in sweat, his hands visibly trembling, and he couldn't seem to gather a single coherent thought. Words escaped him as his mind went blank. After struggling to steady his nerves and gather the courage, Hirano finally blurted out the question, asking Goinda if she was interested in having a boyfriend. Goinda looked amused by his question. With a warm smile, she gently pinched his cheeks and teasingly called him a dummy once more. As she leaned in closer, Hirano panicked all over again, this time completely overwhelmed. He finally lost his struggle to stay awake and fainted, collapsing right onto her chest pillows. As Hirano slowly regained consciousness, he found himself gazing up at the girl of his dreams standing over him. For a moment, he lay there in confusion, trying to make sense of how things had ended up like this. But once it registered, he immediately scrambled to his feet, clearly flustered. He began apologizing in a rush, still trying to figure out exactly what had happened. The whole thing left him deeply embarrassed, especially considering he was the one who had asked her to meet him in the first place. Noticing that Hirano was now fully awake, Goinda brushed the dust off her skirt and began heading out of the gym. As she walked away, Hirano scrambled to find the right words to say, but all he could manage was a faint goodbye. Meanwhile, Goinda couldn't stop replaying what had just happened with Hirano, using her balloons as his pillow. She was grateful for her large bust size, as it had prevented Hirano from slamming his head onto the hard floor. If her chest had been as flat as a mousepad, things could have turned out much worse. Still, a part of her couldn't help but wonder if a slightly bigger cup size could have cushioned the fall completely. A few minutes later, back in class, Goinda confided in her friends about her secret wish to have bigger melons. The girls were caught off guard, not because she wanted to look like an Ike model, but because she claimed it was for safety reasons. Curiosity piqued, they immediately pressed her to reveal who exactly she was trying to protect. But Goinda stayed quiet, keeping the details to herself and offering no further explanation. When it became clear that Goinda wasn't going to spill her secret, her friends quickly came up with a foolproof plan to help her boost her bust size. Their suggestion? Goinda just needed her boyfriend to give her regular massages. Aiko, however, raised an eyebrow, clearly doubtful about the credibility of the method. But the other girls stood by it with confidence, even claiming it was a technique recorded in ancient scrolls. Off to the side, Goinda, half convinced the idea might actually work, quietly pulled out her phone and asked ChatGPT about everything her friends were talking about, all while the debate among the girls continued. Once the arguing died down, one of the girls pointed out the most obvious roadblock. Goinda didn't even have a boyfriend. Without a guide to do the plot enhancement massaging, even though some of the viewers wished they could volunteer, one of her friends offered to step in and help. Goinda paused, gave it some thought, and after a brief moment of hesitation, agreed to let them give it a try. The girls wasted no time and jumped straight into action, spending hours working on Goinda's apples. When they finally paused to check for any changes, they quickly dismissed the lack of results, but Aiko reminded them that these things don't happen overnight. Still, for the sake of documentation, they decided to take before and after photos to track any progress over time. Meanwhile, our boy sat quietly in class, trying to recall what had really happened when he passed out. He had a hazy memory of feeling something soft and bouncy right before losing consciousness, but he couldn't tell if it was real or just his imagination running wild. Still caught up in the bliss of that mysterious moment, his daydream was suddenly interrupted by another text from Aiko. Even though Hirano already had a bad feeling about what the messages might contain, he opened them anyway. The first was a photo of Goinda with the other girls, all smiling. The second was the same group, but this time they were drenched in sweat. Beneath the photos was a message that read, "Notice anything different?" Hirano stared at the images, then replied that it felt like the classroom had suddenly gotten hotter. Back in the girls' class, Aiko burst into laughter at his response, clearly enjoying every bit of his misery. Just then, Goinda walked into the classroom, sipping from a carton of milk. As she passed by, she caught a glimpse of Aiko's phone screen and spotted the bold messages her friend had sent to Hirano. Goinda immediately became furious and started slapping Aiko with both hands, who quickly apologized, insisting she couldn't help herself and just had to ask him. She also hurriedly explained that all she wanted was a third opinion, to see if their cup-size boosting experiment had actually worked. Meanwhile, Hirano finally realized the photos were meant to show a change in cup size, and now he was caught in a serious internal struggle, whether he should keep looking or try to be a decent human being and look away. He kept staring at his phone, then shaking his head over and over, clearly battling with himself. The following day, Goinda and her girls extended an invitation to Hirano and his crew to check out their gang club. As Hirano and his friends entered the room, one of Goinda's friends thanked them for showing up and explained that they had reached out because they were low on members. At that moment, Yujin noticed Hirano lingering just outside the doorway. When he asked what was going on, Hirano simply brushed it off, saying it was nothing. In truth, Hirano couldn't stop thinking about how Aiko had basically commanded him to come to their club. Hirano hesitated as he glanced around the clubroom, surprised to find that it resembled a girl's bedroom more than an actual club. A wave of nervousness washed over him as he finally stepped inside, but the moment his eyes met Goinda's, he quickly looked away without thinking. It was a reflex, he couldn't help it, especially since things had been a bit awkward between them lately. Just thinking back on all of it made Hirano even more uneasy, and he couldn't bring himself to lift his head as he walked deeper into the room. Noticing how tense he was, Yujin quickly stepped in to help, jokingly assuring him that it wasn't a big deal because he was just as anxious. Yujin went on to say that ever since he found out they'd be visiting the game club, he'd been so nervous he hadn't even been able to nap properly. Noticing how nervous the boys seemed, the girls chuckled and remarked that their anxiety was kind of cute. Then they quickly shifted the conversation, asking which game the boys would like to play. But before the boys could suggest an option, Aiko showed them small sticks with text written on them, and Hirano's friends instantly recognized that it was the king game. The two boys began whispering to each other, pointing out that the king game was usually played at more risk parties since it could get pretty daring. That thought made them uneasy, and they started to wonder if a game like that was even appropriate to play at school. However, Yujin thought it over for a moment and suggested that the girls were probably just testing them. That idea brought some relief. They figured they could handle playing the game as long as there was no hidden motive behind it. Meanwhile, Hirano, completely unaware of their quiet conversation, suddenly agreed to play the king game with the girls. His friends were instantly horrified by his blunt response, thinking he had just exposed a hidden agenda and made them all look bad. They quickly whispered at him in frustration, warning him to stay quiet, because the girls might really be testing them, and if he wasn't careful, he could get kicked out for choosing that game. Hirano was completely puzzled by his friend's reaction. He genuinely just wanted to try out the new game and didn't have any hidden intentions. But before the argument could go any further, Aiko cheerfully announced that they would, in fact, be playing the king game. She then began explaining the rules. According to her, the game had 4 rules. The first was that the roles of the king and the subjects would be assigned using numbers from 1 to 5. The second rule stated that the king could pick any of the numbered players as subjects and give them a single order. Hearing that, the boys felt a wave of relief, realizing that the game wasn't some kind of setup after all. Aiko went on to explain that the king's commands were final, but if anyone gave an inappropriate or lewd order, they'd be disqualified from the game. After hearing the rules of the game, Yujin was already thinking about backing out. Hirano and their other friend were stunned, especially since Yujin had been the most hyped about playing in the first place. Despite the surprise, the game soon got underway. One of Gwenda's friends was the first to draw the king's stick. Without hesitating, she commanded her chosen subjects to act as her chair and burst into laughter as she happily sat on their back. Yujin quickly objected, saying that kind of command should count as inappropriate, but nobody seemed to care. After that round, Aiko became the next king and promptly told her subjects to have a thumb wrestling match. Everyone watched as Gwenda locked thumbs with one of the boys, making Hirano feel a weird pain in his chest from jealousy. Meanwhile, off to the side, Yujin was silently begging the universe to make him the next king. His prayers were answered, and he cheered when he finally drew the king's stick. After thinking for a moment, he gave his order. Numbers 1 and 6 had to whisper the name of the person they liked to each other. Everyone was apparently not happy with the typical order Yujin gave, while Gwenda and Hirano were already freaking out as they realized that they were the subjects. A wave of excitement passed over everyone once they realized who the subjects were, and everyone was really curious to know who their friends liked. To carry out Yujin's order, Gwenda leaned closer to Hirano, but her closeness made him really nervous, and he almost forgot about the game. Hirano was dying to know who Gwenda had a crush on, and he was pretty sure it wasn't him. Still, the thought of her saying another guy's name made his stomach twist, but instead of whispering a name, Gwenda suddenly blew a puff of air into his ear, completely throwing him off and sending his heart into overdrive. His friends were desperate to find out what name she had whispered, but Hirano couldn't give them anything because, well, Gwenda hadn't revealed anything. On getting to school the next day, Aiko and the other girls quickly cornered Gwenda in the clubroom. They were clearly upset that she had disobeyed the king's command by refusing to reveal the name of her crush, as Yuji had instructed. Aiko leaned in close, reminding Gwenda that the king's orders weren't optional. Without giving Gwenda the chance to respond, Aiko declared that they'd be starting a second round of the game. Before Gwenda could say anything, Aiko tossed her phone to another friend, telling her to call Hirano right away. However, the friend never got the chance because Gwenda suddenly panicked and almost attacked her, in a frantic attempt to snatch the phone from her. Aiko saw Gwenda's unexpected feisty reaction to calling Hirano, and was surprised to see how angry Gwenda was, so Aiko quickly called off the idea of contacting Hirano. Instead, she came up with a new challenge. Gwenda would have to walk around the first-year floor and reveal her crush's name to the very first person who spoke to her. Aiko assured her that if no one approached, they'd drop the issue for good, and she'd be off the hook. Gwenda agreed to the deal and began preparing for her walk. However, her friends weren't too happy with how she was dressed. It gave off an intimidating vibe, and they worried no one would have the courage to talk to her. Meanwhile, over in the first-year classroom, Yujin was still going on and on about how awesome the club visit had been the day before. Hirano and the other friend were clearly getting tired of his endless chatter, but Yujin didn't care. He just brushed off their complaints and shifted the conversation to the legendary clubroom sofa. According to him, what really stood out wasn't the sofa itself, but how those three senior hotties were lounging on it, legs crossed and showing off their thighs. This time, though, the other friend actually agreed with Yujin. He wiped some imaginary sweat from his forehead and admitted he'd barely managed to keep himself together. Suddenly, the guys shifted their focus to Hirano, catching him off guard as they asked whether he'd gotten a good look at Goinda. Yujin specifically talked about how heavenly Goinda's thighs were. Yujin went on, saying that every time Goinda crossed and uncrossed her legs, he couldn't help but burn the image into his memory. He even shamelessly admitted he was this close to catching a glimpse of her peach cover. That was the last straw for the other friend, who quickly called him out for spewing such wild fantasies. But Yujin didn't care. He was clearly still riding the high of that steamy moment. Meanwhile, Hirano, who had been silently wrestling with his jealousy, finally snapped. He shot Yujin a glare and told him to stop talking about Goinda in such a sus way. The guys were stunned. They hadn't expected Hirano to snap like that. An awkward silence followed as they all stared at him, trying to figure out what had just happened. Flustered and clearly embarrassed, Hirano quickly made up an excuse about needing to rinse his face and rushed out of the room. As he ran through the hallway, regret started creeping in. He knew Yujin was always like that, joking around, and under normal circumstances, they'd all just laugh it off. Suddenly, Hirano came to a standstill when he noticed Goinda cautiously creeping along the corridor, as if she were either sneaking around like a ninja or playing hide-and-seek with her own shadow. With a nervous voice, he called out her name, but the instant she turned and gave him a stunned, wide-eyed look, he regretted it. Without a word, Goinda turned to face the wall and began to tremble, leaving Hirano completely baffled by how shaken she seemed. Hirano noticed that Goinda's skirt had ridden up, so he quietly suggested she fix it while she leaned against the wall. Upon hearing him, Goinda awkwardly rose from the floor and adjusted her skirt, giving a small nod in response. Hirano immediately felt a wave of regret and apologized. Still overwhelmed by the awkwardness of the moment, he was about to turn and leave when, out of nowhere, Goinda grabbed his hand and slammed him firmly against the wall. As she leaned in toward him, Goinda suddenly recalled Aiko's dare to confess the name of her crush to the first person who spoke to her. Staring at Hirano, she simply said his name, then turned and walked off without offering any explanation. Left stunned, Hirano slid down against the wall, his heart pounding uncontrollably as he tried to calm himself. Later, when Hirano told the guys what had happened with Goinda in the hallway, Yujin immediately assumed that she must have been upset with him. At the same time, when Goinda rejoined her group of friends, they eagerly asked how her mission went, but were left speechless when she suddenly asked if they could see her underwear. The following day in the changing room, Aiko teasingly lifted Goinda's skirt and laughed when she noticed that, instead of her usual peach-colored cover, Goinda was wearing shorts underneath. As a flustered Goinda tried to respond, Aiko asked what made her decide to wear shorts that day. Before she could answer, another friend playfully did the same to Aiko and pointed out that she too was wearing shorts. Aiko's cheeks turned red at the question, and she quickly tried to explain that she had panicked the day before when Goinda unexpectedly came up to them, saying that Hirano had made a comment about it. Their friend laughed at Aiko's embarrassment but stopped teasing once she revealed that, unlike the two of them, she was wearing a pair of adorable Victoria's Secret bumhuggers. Aiko quickly scolded her, saying it was totally inappropriate, and if anyone happened to catch a glimpse of her in something like that, it would be a disaster. Meanwhile, Hirano was still lost in thought, replaying the moment Goinda had said his name. He barely noticed anything around him, completely absorbed in the memory of her soft voice. Still distracted, he unknowingly wandered straight into the middle of the girls' argument about wearing peach covers and other things and whatnot. The moment the girls spotted Hirano, they all jumped in surprise. Without skipping a beat, the third friend stormed over to him. Boldly and without hesitation, she lifted her skirt to reveal her underwear, telling Hirano to take a look. Hirano stood there, completely stunned by what she'd just done. Meanwhile, she casually returned to her friends, saying it wasn't a big deal if that's what she had on. Still, Aiko was of the opinion that a peach protector was a peach protector, no matter how fancy the brand. After saying that, she walked over to Hirano and showed him the shorts she had on. Aiko seemed genuinely proud, arguing that shorts were a much better choice, and even turned to Goinda for her approval. The conversation quickly turned into another debate, as their friend continued to claim that shorts weren't cute. Aiko disagreed, and tried to reassure her friend, saying she'd look great in them. But the other girl simply assumed Aiko was trying to trick her. To finally settle the debate, all three girls turned to Hirano, lifted their skirts to show off their underwear, and asked him what he thought of their pics. Flustered, Hirano quickly shielded his eyes to avoid seeing too much and nervously admitted it was a bit overwhelming for him. His response caught the girls off guard, and they were instantly embarrassed by what they'd just done. Flustered and embarrassed, the three of them rushed back to the club room. Goinda, clearly mortified, immediately yanked off her shorts, claiming they were the reason she felt so humiliated. Aiko followed suit, removing hers as well and saying that whether she wore shorts or peach protector, it made no real difference. Their friend chimed in too, slipping off her coochie cover and pointing out that it was already embarrassing enough if someone looked up their skirts. With that, all three of them tossed their undergarments into the air, boldly declaring they didn't need them anymore. Meanwhile, Hirano's friends spotted him sitting on the floor with his face buried in his hands, clearly distressed. Concerned, they rushed over and asked what was wrong. In a low, uneasy voice, Hirano told them that the girls had suddenly cornered him, and the whole experience had taken a toll on his mental state. 2 weeks later, Hirano checked his temperature and saw that it was 37.8 degrees. He had a fever and was resting in the infirmary. Despite feeling unwell, the only person on his mind was Goinda, though he was certain she wouldn't be there. Instead of Goinda, he found himself surrounded by his close pals, who had come to check on him out of deep concern and even offered to carry him home. But Hirano politely declined their offer, explaining that his parents would be arriving soon to pick him up. However, shortly after his friends left, the nurse walked in and let him know that his parents would be running a bit late. She told him to get some rest and suggested changing into gym clothes if he started feeling sweaty, then quietly left the room. Several minutes later, as he lay alone on the bed, Hirano suddenly woke up and realized he must have blacked out while changing into his gym clothes. The loneliness of being by himself began to sink in, and before he knew it, he had accidentally said Goinda's name out loud. Startled by what he'd just done, Hirano quickly covered his mouth, relieved that no one had heard him. But right at that moment, the curtains drew back and there was Goinda peeking in. The moment he noticed her, Hirano, flustered and embarrassed, quickly shut his eyes and pretended to be asleep. But even with his eyes closed, he was stunned when he felt Goinda suddenly climb onto the bed. His first thought was that she might be planning to lie down next to him. He stayed completely still, thinking it had to be some strange dream. But as soon as her cold hands touched his forehead, he realized this was actually happening. Being that close to Goinda was enough to make Hirano panic, but he kept his eyes shut, trying hard to act like he was sound asleep. He let out a quiet sigh of relief when he sensed her finally getting up to leave. Still, a part of him felt a little let down. After all, most people would have stayed a bit longer to look after someone who was sick. Just then, Hirano heard the rustling of clothes and was taken aback by the idea that Goinda might actually be stripping. His heart started racing uncontrollably as he tried to make sense of what she was planning. When he thought he heard her quietly say something about needing to warm him up, panic kicked in. Without thinking, Hirano shot up in bed, determined to stop whatever was about to happen. But when Hirano finally worked up the nerve to peek past the curtains, he was stunned to see Goinda grinding something with intense focus, looking more like a mad scientist than anything else. For a moment, he thought he was hallucinating through his eyes. It felt like he was witnessing some kind of death pharmacy. Then it hit him. All Goinda had done was put on an apron. Hidden behind the curtain, Hirano continued watching her in silence, still baffled as to why she was making medicine. He couldn't believe she was actually doing it for him. Hirano's shock deepened when he saw Goinda take a sip of the concoction herself. But the moment she forcefully spat it out, Hirano became completely convinced she was trying to poison him. Suddenly, she began walking toward him with the cup in hand, and Hirano's body tensed up in panic. So he instantly closed his eyes, pretending to be asleep again. But his sleeping act didn't stop Goinda at all. She climbed onto his bed and gently squeezed his cheeks, trying to open his mouth while wearing a genuinely worried expression. For a split second, Hirano considered pushing her away. But then he recalled how she had tasted the medicine earlier, and he realized it could be the perfect opportunity for an indirect kiss. Several hours later, Hirano suddenly woke up and was shocked to find his fever completely gone. As he rolled to the other side, he started thinking about the wild dream he just had. But then he froze when he noticed Goinda lying right there beside him. As a result, Hirano's hand immediately flew to his mouth, and his whole body trembled with nervousness. After 7 p.m., the infirmary began to dim as the daylight faded. Despite the hour, Hirano and Goinda were still lying across from each other. Hirano suspected that, like him, Goinda probably hadn't bothered to put any clothes back on. Wanting to avoid an embarrassing situation if the nurse walked in, he quickly got dressed. But before he could do much else, his mother stepped into the room, apologizing for arriving so late. The moment Hirano's mom saw him in the room with Goinda, she looked completely shocked. Just then, Goinda woke up and smiled in relief when she saw Hirano standing there, clearly recovered. Noticing that Goinda was now awake, Hirano's mom quickly approached her, introduced herself, and began thanking her for taking care of Hirano's needs while he was out. That sent a wave of embarrassment crashing over Hirano, who practically begged his mom to cut it out with all the suggestive comments. Soon after, as Hirano, his mom, and Goinda exited the infirmary, the nurse standing by the door reminded both students to take care of themselves. On their way out of the school, Hirano's mom realized it might not be safe for Goinda to head home alone that late, so she suggested that Hirano invite Goinda over for dinner. Hirano instantly shot the idea down, insisting there was no way Goinda would ever agree to something like that. Cut to the next scene. Goinda was sitting at Hirano's dinner table, having dinner with them. Hirano still couldn't believe that the stunning Goinda was actually in his living room. It felt so surreal, like she was part of a green screen effect. After dinner, Goinda noticed Hirano and his mom tidying up in the kitchen and offered to help. As the three of them stood washing dishes together, Hirano's mom kept playfully teasing him about what had happened in the infirmary. At one point, she even joked that having Goinda around felt like gaining a new family member. Right after that, she made a beeline for the bathroom, to call Hirano's dad, of course. When she called, Hirano's dad assumed it was just about dinner, and quickly let her know he'd be eating at work and coming home late. But dinner was the last thing on her mind. She dropped the bombshell that there was a chance they might be getting a grandchild. That sent the two of them spiraling into full-on baby mode, chatting excitedly about Hirano becoming a dad and even brainstorming which kind of stroller they should buy for their future grandbaby. The mom also told the dad that Hirano had brought his girlfriend home, and that she was absolutely gorgeous. The moment he heard that, the dad, who originally said he'd be home late, showed up faster than the flash. Wasting no time, he jumped straight into interrogation mode, turning to Goinda and asking just how far their relationship had progressed. Before she could even answer, he fired off another question, asking if it was a B or C. The entire room froze, panic setting in as everyone processed what he just said. To answer the dad's mysterious question, both Hirano and Goinda paused to think hard. Goinda quickly cooked up her own theory. A meant marriage, was living together, stood for dating, and just meant being friends. So, without hesitation, she nervously mumbled D to the dad. Both parents froze in stunned silence at her response. Confused by their reaction, Hirano turned to the one source of all truth, Google. He typed in, "What does a B and C mean?" when asking how far a couple has gone. Just as he hit send, he noticed Goinda subtly peeking at his phone screen, clearly just as desperate to know the real meaning. When the search results popped up, Hirano and Goinda stared at the screen in horror. A meant kissing, B was for petting, C implied plot development, and the long-dreaded stood for pregnancy. Both of them froze, completely stunned. Just as the awkwardness hit its peak, Hirano's mom casually strolled over to Goinda and asked if she'd like to stay the night since it was already so late. Before Goinda could even respond, the mom added that she could also share a bed with Hirano. Will Hirano be able to survive sharing the same bed with Goinda? Comment "Naughty Secret" if you're eager to find out in our part 2. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. As always, thanks for watching.